The mortar round hit 3 feet from Garza, and he didn't even scream. Just went flat ears, blown mouth full of dirt, staring at a sky that had turned orange and wrong. Aiden grabbed his collar and dragged him behind the rock, counting heads through the smoke. 1, 2, 5, 7. Where is 8 there? Rodriguez down, but moving blood black across his cheek in the dark. 32 enemy fighters, 8 men. No communications, no air support. No way off this mountain. Aiden pressed his back against the granite and did the math no sergeant wants to do. The numbers said they were already dead. Then a single shot cracked from somewhere no one on his team was standing, and one enemy commander dropped and never got up. The first mortar round hit at 0317. Sergeant Aiden Cole didn't hear it coming. That was the thing about mortars fired from elevation. By the time your brain registered the whistle, the ground was already moving under your boots. The explosion threw him sideways into Corporal Hawk Hawkins, and both men hit the dirt-hard rifles, clattering ears screaming with that hollow, cotton-stuffed silence that always followed a blast too close. "Contact!" Hawk shouted purely out of reflex because there was nothing useful about the word anymore. They all knew there was contact. Contact had found them 20 minutes ago and hadn't let go. Aiden rolled, got his knees under him, pressed his back against the rock outcropping that had become their world. A narrow shelf of granite on the eastern face of a ridge so remote that it didn't have a name on any map he'd ever been issued. He counted heads automatically the way a man does when he's been leading soldiers long enough that the habit becomes involuntary. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where's Garza? 5, 6. There's Priya bleeding from the forearm but still up 7, 8. 8 men, all present, all alive, for now. Cole. Corporal Danny Reyes crawled up beside him, pressing close enough that Aiden could feel the heat radiating off the man's body armor. Danny's face was streaked with dirt, and something darker, not his blood, Aiden determined, checking fast. Probably Rodriguez's. Rodriguez had caught shrapnel from the second round, a jagged piece across the left cheekbone that had bled like something catastrophic, but was miraculously superficial. Cole, I can't raise command. Static across every frequency. Someone's sitting on our comms. I know. That's not a coincidence. I know that too. Aiden pressed his forehead against the cold stone for exactly 1 second. He allowed himself exactly 1 second. And then he lifted his rifle, eased to the edge of the outcropping, and looked. What he saw made his stomach drop through the mountain. 30 fighters, maybe more. Spread across 3 positions, high left direct center, and flanking right, moving in deliberate coordinated patterns that told him immediately these weren't opportunistic irregulars. These were trained men. Someone had drilled them, planned this chosen, this ridge, this night, this exact blind spot in American operational coverage. Someone had known exactly where Viper Squad would be, and when, and with how many men, which meant someone had talked. Which meant this wasn't ambush. This was execution. Hawk, Aiden said quietly. Yeah. How many rounds you carrying? A pause. The kind that meant the answer was bad. 2 full mags and change. Started the nightlight because command said, I know what command said. Aiden pulled back from the edge. He looked at his squad. 8 faces all turned toward him with the specific expression he'd learned to read over 11 years of service. Not fear exactly, but the tight-jawed, clear-eyed look of men who had done the math and were waiting to see if their sergeant had found a number they'd missed. Listen to me. We don't run. Not down that slope. They've got the approach covered. We'll lose half the team before we hit the tree line. We hold here. We make them come to us. We use the rock. There's 30 of them, Specialist Marcus Webb said. He said it flatly, not panicking, just stating the arithmetic. Webb was like that, a former engineering student who'd enlisted after his brother was killed overseas, a man who thought in load-bearing equations and stress tolerances, even when the structure in question was their own survival. 32, Priya Chandra corrected, pressing a field dressing against her forearm with practiced efficiency. She'd already counted. Of course she had. 2 more came around the northern spur while you were looking south, and at least one of them is carrying an RPG. Silence settled over the squad for a beat. Private Tony Garza, 22 years old. The youngest man on the team, a kid from South Texas who still had a photograph of his mother tucked inside his left boot, cleared his throat. Sarge, what are the odds? Aiden didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, but because the true answer, the honest mathematical no-sentiment answer, was something close to catastrophic, and he was trying to find a way to frame it that would keep his men fighting instead of grieving. Better than zero, he finally said. Garza nodded slowly. Okay, yeah. Better than zero works. The second mortar round hit 40 feet to the north, close enough to send a cascade of rock fragments rattling against their helmets. Rodriguez cursed in 2 languages. Webb dropped flat and covered his neck with both hands. Hawk returned fire, 3 disciplined shots in the direction of the muzzle flash, and then the night went weirdly, temporarily still. In that stillness, Aiden heard something that didn't belong. 1 shot. A single report from somewhere south-southeast, elevated maybe 300 yards out. Not one of his men he was certain of that with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had fired alongside his squad long enough to know every weapon's voice. This was a different rifle. A different position, a different shooter, and one of the enemy combatants who had been advancing on the right flank, a man who had been moving with obvious authority, gesturing and directing the fighters around him, simply stopped moving. Just like that. There, then not there. Down and not getting up. Aiden stared. Nobody on his squad had taken that shot. Did you? Hawk started. No. Aiden's voice was barely above a whisper. Then who? I don't know. He pressed back against the rock. His mind moved fast, sorting possibilities. Friendly QRF arrived early without comms notification. Unlikely they'd have announced. Air support with a precision munition. No aircraft sound. No signature. A local ally he hadn't been briefed on. Possible. A rival faction engaging the same enemy for entirely separate reasons. Also possible. Or something else. Someone else. Someone who was very good and very quiet and apparently on their side. Keep your heads down and keep shooting, Aiden ordered. Whatever just happened, we use it. He didn't know it yet, none of them did, but that single shot was not an accident. It was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the opening move in a sequence so precisely planned that it had begun 6 hours before Viper Squad had even arrived on the ridge. Her name in the file that almost no one was cleared to access was Raven, not her birth name. Birth names were for people who could afford to exist officially, and Raven had not officially existed for the better part of 4 years. There was a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had grown up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had been a nationally ranked competitive shooter at 17, who had enrolled in pre-law at the University of New Mexico, and then very quietly been approached during her sophomore year by a man who carried no business card and gave only a first name. That meeting had changed everything. Elena Vasquez had continued to attend classes for 1 more semester, had taken her final exams, had told her roommate she was transferring to a school on the East Coast for a family reason, and had never been seen in Albuquerque again. Raven had stepped into the space Elena Vasquez had vacated. She had been inserted into this operational theater 72 hours before Viper Squad's mission. Not in support of Viper Squad, she hadn't known about them. Not then. She was there for a different reason, tracking a different thread in a web so complex that the individual strands sometimes didn't appear connected until you were looking at the whole picture from high enough above it. She had been in position on this particular ridgeline for 11 hours when the enemy convoy arrived below her. She had been still for so long that a mountain bird had landed on the rock 6 inches from her right hand and stayed there for 20 minutes, apparently having decided she was part of the landscape. She watched the convoy unload. She counted men and weapons with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the value of intelligence was directly proportional to its accuracy, and accuracy required time. 32 fighters. She confirmed Priya's count before Priya had made it. She identified the command structure within the first hour, the way men organized themselves around authority, told you almost everything if you knew how to read it. and Raven had been reading it for years. Commander Rashid Karim. She'd had a file on him. Medium height, compact, moving with the economic efficiency of a man who had been in combat long enough to eliminate waste in every gesture. He communicated with his lieutenants through a system of hand signals that looked improvised, but wasn't. She cataloged each gesture, building the translation in her mind. He was smart, careful, the kind of enemy commander who wouldn't make the obvious mistake. She respected that about him in the cold, analytical way she respected most competent things. It didn't change what she was going to do. When Viper Squad arrived on the ridge, when she heard the sound of American boots moving in the dark, and understood immediately that something had gone wrong with the operational deconfliction, that these soldiers had been inserted into an area they didn't know was already compromised. She made her decision in approximately 4 seconds. No communication. Comms were jammed. No time to establish alternative contact, even if she'd had the means. No way to warn them. And even if she could warn them, they were already boxed. The enemy had prepared positions on 3 sides before the squad arrived. Warning them now would only tell them they were about to die without giving them any option to avoid it. So she worked with what she had: herself, her rifle, her ammunition, her training, and the 6 hours of observation that had given her the complete enemy picture before any of this became an emergency. The first shot, the one that dropped the right flank leader, she'd been holding it for 20 minutes, waiting for the right moment. Not the moment when it would save the most lives immediately, but the moment when it would cause the maximum cascading confusion in the enemy command structure. A leader died at a critical juncture, and the men behind him hesitated, looked around for guidance, broke their formation rhythm just slightly, and that hesitation was worth more than the single life it cost them, because it gave Viper Squad 30 additional seconds to adjust their position. 30 seconds didn't sound like much. In combat, 30 seconds was an eternity. She moved before the sound of the shot had fully dissipated, relocating 40 yards along the ridgeline, with the fluid, unhurried speed of someone who had practiced that exact movement pattern until it was instinctual. New position, new angle. She scanned for the next priority. Karim's remaining senior lieutenant, a tall man who had been coordinating the center advance, was adjusting his position in response to the first shot, moving his men behind cover. Good instinct. Wrong direction. She'd anticipated it. She let him settle, let him believe he was behind the cover he'd chosen. And then not immediately, not for 90 more seconds, long enough that the 2 shots wouldn't feel connected to the surviving enemy fighters, she took him too. Down on the ridge, Aiden Cole heard the second shot. He turned to Hawk. Hawk was already looking at him. "That's the same rifle," Hawk said. "Yeah. 2 for 2. Yeah. So we've got what, a sniper out there? Something like that." Aiden looked at his squad, looked at Garza's white-knuckled grip on his rifle, at Webb, running calculations behind his eyes, at Priya, wrapping her own arm with the focused precision of a woman who simply refused to be inconvenienced by her own injury. He made a decision. Whatever it is, whoever it is, they're buying us time. We don't waste it. Reposition north face, use the second outcropping. Move. They moved. And as they moved, something happened that Aiden wouldn't fully understand until much later. The enemy advance slowed, not because of anything Viper Squad did, not because the enemy was afraid or retreating or reassessing their numbers, but because in the span of 8 minutes, 3 command figures had been removed from the enemy's operational structure with such precision and such silence that the fighters on the ground were beginning to ask a question their radios should have answered but couldn't. What is happening and who is doing it? That question, that gnawing, unlocatable fear, was worth 30 soldiers. Rodriguez found Aiden in the reposition and grabbed his sleeve. "Sarge." His voice was low, urgent. The field dressing on his cheek was already soaked through, but he hadn't complained, hadn't slowed down. "I need to tell you something, before things get worse. Talk fast. When Command assigned us this route, when they changed the insertion point 48 hours ago last minute, I heard something." Rodriguez glanced toward the others, instinctively checking distance. There was chatter in the prep room. 2 officers talking about a separate asset in the operational area. Something that was already running. something they didn't want us to know about because the classification level was it was above mission compartment. Aiden stared at him. You're telling me someone knew there was already an asset out here? I'm telling you someone knew there might be an asset in the region. And they sent us anyway, without telling us. That means either they thought the two operations wouldn't overlap, or they thought they would and decided it was acceptable. Rodriguez met his eyes. Or they needed us on this ridge for a reason I don't understand yet. Aiden processed that for exactly the time he had available, which was not long. We talk about this when we're off this mountain. Roger that. If we get off this mountain. We're getting off this mountain. Aiden said it with a certainty he only half felt, but certainty was a leadership tool as much as a personal state of mind, and he deployed it deliberately. Move up. The third shot came 6 minutes later. This one Aiden saw the effect of in real time. He'd been watching the enemy center formation through the scope of his own rifle, tracking the advanced judging distance, when a man who had been gesturing toward his fighters simply fell forward and was still. No drama. No outcry. The men around him froze for 2 full seconds, staring at their fallen comrade as if they couldn't process what had happened. And in those 2 seconds, Aiden saw something that genuinely shocked him. Panic. Not in 1 or 2 men, in all of them. A wave of it visible even at distance, moving through the formation like a physical thing. Men who had been advancing with coordinated purpose suddenly broke their lines pressed against cover, began looking in every direction at once. 2 fighters ran left, 1 ran right. The formation that had been a coherent tactical threat 20 seconds ago was now a collection of individually frightened men without a center. What the? Webb breathed beside him. That's not just a kill, Priya said, and her voice carried the particular tone of professional recognition. She had a background in military psychology, had written her thesis on the operational impact of leadership attrition in combat units. That's targeted command disruption. Whoever is out there isn't just shooting, they're taking apart the structure. Aiden lowered his rifle slowly. They're doing our job for us. They're doing a job that requires knowing who leads, who coordinates, and in what order the removals cause the maximum organizational collapse. She paused. That's not a field improvisation. That's prepared. That's planned. How long would something like that take to plan? She looked at him. Hours. At minimum, which meant whoever was out there had been watching this enemy force long before Viper Squad had arrived. Which meant they were walking into someone else's operation. Which meant, and this thought landed with a quiet, cold weight that settled in Aiden's chest and didn't leave. They hadn't been sent here to complete the mission. They'd been sent here as bait, or as witnesses, or both. He didn't say any of that out loud. His squad was holding together with discipline and training and the specific brand of American soldier stubbornness that simply refused to stop fighting regardless of odds. He would not shatter that by sharing a theory he couldn't yet prove. But he filed it, deep, and he kept watching the dark. At 0408 something changed in the enemy movement that brought everything to a sharper, more dangerous edge. The disorganized panic that had followed the third command kill began slowly to reorganize. Kareem, still alive, still thinking, still adapting, had understood what was happening. Aiden couldn't see him clearly, but he could see the effect of his presence moving through the remaining fighters. Men who had been scattered began to consolidate, began to listen, began to breathe together again. A good commander was the most dangerous thing on a battlefield. Not because of what he could do himself, but because of what he enabled everyone around him to do. Garza appeared at Aiden's shoulder voice, barely above a breath. Sarge, they're reforming. I see it. Third position on the left. I think they just brought up the heavy gun. Aiden looked. Garza was right. A mounted weapon being repositioned toward the ridge with the careful deliberateness of men who had finally decided that precision was no longer necessary, that overwhelming force was the simpler solution. If they get that lined up, Garza started. I know. We can't stay behind this rock if... Garza. Aiden's voice was quiet, final. Not unkind, but absolute. I know. Give me a second to think. He pressed against the stone and thought. He had 8 men, limited ammunition, jammed communications, an unknown friendly asset, at an unknown position, doing unknown things. An enemy force that had been disrupted but not destroyed, and was now adapting a heavy weapon being brought into effective range, and a theory about being used as bait that he couldn't afford to dwell on right now. He had the Rock at his back. He had his squad. He had better than zero. From somewhere out in the dark, as if in direct response to the moment the 4th shot rang out. And this time the effect was different from anything that had come before. Because this time, the enemy didn't panic. They didn't scatter. They stopped. All of them. A collective stillness that was somehow more unnerving than movement. 30-odd fighting men simply freezing in place, the way animals freeze when something in their environment signals a threat so fundamental that movement itself feels dangerous. In that stillness, Aiden heard Priya's voice, very quiet, very steady. They can't find the position, she said. 4 shots, 4 different angles, and they still can't locate the source. They're starting to think there's more than one shooter. Hawk let out a low, involuntary laugh, the kind that isn't really humor, just the sound a man makes when the situation reaches an edge of absurdity that even terror can't fully contain. How many do they think are out there? Right now? Priya watched the frozen enemy line. I'd guess they think they're the ones who are surrounded. Webb turned to Aiden slowly. His voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing his words like he was calculating a structural load. Sergeant, whoever this is, do you think they can actually get us out of this? Aiden Cole looked out at the night. At the enemy that had come to kill his squad. At the invisible, silent, impossibly precise presence that had already altered the mathematics of their survival in ways he didn't fully comprehend. At his 8 soldiers bloodied, tired, burning, with the particular fierce aliveness that only danger at this proximity could produce. He thought about what Rodriguez had told him, about a separate asset, about a classification level above mission compartment, about being sent here anyway. He thought about a single rifle, 4 shots, 4 dead leaders, 30 frozen men. I think, he said slowly, that whoever is out there has been doing this a lot longer than us. And I think they made a choice to help us that they didn't have to make. He turned back to his squad. So we make the most of every second they give us. Tight formation, north face, conserve ammunition, and stay low. We hold. Garza nodded. Priya nodded. Hawk was already moving. Rodriguez stayed a half-second longer, looking at Aiden with the expression of a man carrying a weight he was choosing for now to set down. Better than zero, Sarge. Better than zero, Rodriguez. Move. The 5th shot came before they'd finished repositioning, and the 6th came 30 seconds after that. And with each shot, the World Viper squad was surviving in changed a little more compressed, clarified, stripped down to its most essential truth, that somewhere in the dark, someone had decided they were worth saving. They didn't know who. They didn't know why. But they were still alive to wonder. And on this mountain, on this ridge, in this night, that should have been the last night for 8 American soldiers, that was everything. The enemy was regrouping. The clock was moving. And Raven was already calculating the next move in a sequence that would either save every life on that ridge or demand the ultimate price for trying. The 7th shot never came. That was what scared Aiden most. 6 shots. 6 dead. And then silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, packed tight, with something he couldn't name. The enemy had stopped advancing. His squad had stopped bleeding, at least for the moment. And the ridge sat between 2 forces in a stillness so complete that he could hear Garza breathing. 2 feet away, could hear Rodriguez pressing the soaked dressing harder against his cheek, with a faint, wet sound, could hear his own heartbeat working too fast against his ribs. He waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. Why'd they stop? Hawk asked. Because they're thinking, Priya said. She had finished wrapping her forearm and was now sitting with her back against the rock rifle across her knees, eyes closed, not resting, but calculating. They lost 6 men, including at least 3 command positions, and they still don't know where the fire is coming from. If you were Kareem right now, what would you do? I'd pull back and reassess, Webb said. No, you wouldn't. Priya opened her eyes. You'd be angrier than that. You'd reassess for about 4 minutes and then you'd commit harder because pulling back feels like losing. And commanders like Kareem don't lose in front of their men. She paused. He's going to come. And when he comes, he's going to come with everything he has left. Aiden absorbed that. He turned it over, examined it from every angle. The way you examine a cracked piece of load-bearing equipment, looking for the failure point, the place where it falls apart. The problem was that Priya was almost certainly right. The secondary problem was that even understanding what Kareem would do didn't give them a clear answer to what they should do about it. He looked at his squad. 7 faces turned toward him in the dark, each carrying its own particular weight. Garza had that photograph of his mother tucked in his boot, and Aiden knew the kid was thinking about it without thinking about it the way soldiers always carried the people they loved. Not in the front of their minds, but behind everything, a constant low frequency that you couldn't turn off and didn't want to. Hawk was doing the thing he always did before something bad happened, which was rolling his left shoulder in a slow circle, working out a tension that never fully left. Rodriguez had both hands wrapped around his rifle. Now the field dressing forgotten the blood dry on his cheek like a mask. Webb was still running equations. Patel and Rodriguez's teammate were pressed flat and quiet, conserving everything. Priya was already thinking 3 moves ahead. 8 people. Every one of them trusting him with something they couldn't afford to lose. All right, he said. Here's what we know. We have an asset out there who is working. We don't know their situation, their ammunition, or their next action. We cannot rely on them, and we cannot contact them. We plan as if we're alone, because functionally we are. He looked at each face in turn. I need a count. Ammunition, real numbers, no optimism. They gave him the numbers. The numbers were bad. Combined across 8 soldiers, they had enough for a sustained engagement, lasting approximately 7 to 9 minutes before they were firing on empty. Against 30-plus fighters with a heavy weapon now positioned 200 yards north of their outcropping. 7 to 9 minutes was a sentence, not a survival window. Webb said it out loud because Webb was constitutionally incapable of leaving arithmetic unspoken. We're looking at a hard ceiling, Sergeant. Even if they come in slow, even if we're perfect. I know what we're looking at. I'm just saying the math. Webb. Aiden's voice was flat. Not angry, just done. The math is not the enemy. Those 30 men are the enemy. Focus on them. Webb closed his mouth, nodded, went back to his rifle. Garza shifted beside Aiden, leaned in just slightly, and said in a voice so low it barely existed. You think that shooter's still out there? Yeah. You think they're okay? Aiden looked at the dark in the direction the shots had come from. South-southeast. Elevated. Not moving, or at least the shots hadn't indicated movement toward them, hadn't escalated. Whoever it was, they were playing a long, slow, extraordinarily patient game. I think they're exactly where they want to be, he said. Garza exhaled. Good. That's good. A beat. I don't know why, but that makes me feel better. Me too, kid. Me too. Then the enemy moved. Not the way Priya had predicted, not the all-in committed assault of a commander swallowing his pride and throwing his weight forward. Something smarter than that. Something that made Aiden's stomach clench with a specific professional dread. They split. 3 groups moving simultaneously, each taking a separate approach vector, with the kind of coordinated precision that told him Kareem had used the silence not to reassess, but to reorganize, to take his disrupted command structure and build something new from what was left. One group pushing center, keeping their heads down, moving fast and low to draw fire and attention. One group going wide, left, wide enough to come around the outcropping's northern edge where the rock cover thinned. And one group smaller, quieter, barely visible, even as Aiden tracked them, moving to the slope below the ridge's eastern face. They were going to come up from underneath. South face, he said, immediately turning. "Webb, Patel, south face right now, they're coming up from below. Hawk north edge, watch that flank. Everyone else center, keep their heads down, controlled fire, make every round count." The squad responded with the automatic efficiency of trained soldiers. No wasted motion, no questions. Just the clean, compressed sound of 8 people moving to positions that might be the last positions they ever held. The firefight that followed was the kind that didn't have poetry in it. There was no heroic charge, no cinematic moment of clarity. There was noise and heat, and the terrifying speed at which a controlled situation could slide toward chaos in the space of seconds. Webb opened up on the eastern slope, and his fire was good, disciplined, accurate. But there were more men coming up than he could handle alone, and Patel took a round across the left side, not penetrating the plate, but the impact was enough to throw him off the rock. And then Webb was screaming for backup, while still firing because Webb processed priorities faster than most people processed sentences. Aiden moved. He was at Webb's shoulder before the thought to move had fully completed, adding his fire to the slope below, feeling the heat of the barrel through his gloves. Beside him, Webb said through clenched teeth, "There's 8 of them, at least 8. Coming up the eastern crack. I see them. We don't have the ammunition to..." "I know. So what do we..." The shot came from outside their position. From south-southeast. From the elevation where 6 prior shots had originated. It hit the lead man on the eastern approach with the same signature as everything that had preceded it. Sudden, total, no warning, and the man went down in a way that stopped the 4 fighters immediately behind him, cold. 1 second of frozen disbelief. Then they scrambled back down. Aiden exhaled. Webb stared at the empty slope. "They're still there." "Yes. How did they know we needed..." "Because they're watching everything." Aiden grabbed Webb's shoulder briefly. A contact that was part steadying and part gratitude for something he couldn't quite articulate. "They see the whole picture. They're not just shooting, they're managing this." He felt something shift inside him in that moment, something he didn't have a precise name for, a feeling that was part relief and part humility, and part something that might have been awe if he'd had the leisure to examine it. Someone out there in the dark had, in the space of a single shot, made a decision that saved 2 of his men, and they'd made it without being asked, without communication, without anything except their own observation and judgment, and whatever had driven them to be on this mountain on this night in the first place. He made himself a private promise if they survived this, he was going to find out who that was. The center attack pushed forward again, 40 seconds after the eastern group retreated. Kareem had timed it. The assault on the slope had been a probe designed to pull Viper Squad's attention east, while the center group closed distance under the cover of the distraction. They were closer now, close enough that individual faces were distinguishable, close enough that Aiden could see the concentration on the nearest fighter's face as the man sighted in on Hawk's position. Hawk moved first. 3 rounds fast and accurate, dropping the nearest threat. But behind that man were 4 more, and behind those 4 were the rest of the center group, and the ammunition count in Aiden's head was ticking down like a clock that couldn't be reset. "Hawk, move left." Priya's voice sharp and immediate. Hawk moved left. A burst of fire hit exactly where he'd been standing. "How did you know?" he started. "The angle of the muzzle flash," she said, already moving herself, repositioning to a new firing point. "I've been watching the pattern. They're not firing randomly, they're walking it. Pay attention to where they last shot and move away from the line." The squad adapted. It was imperfect combat adaptation. Always was rough and reactive, and operating on incomplete information at speed, but the team began to move less predictably, and the enemy fire, which had been tightening, began to scatter again. Then Rodriguez's rifle ran dry. "I'm out," he said. Just that. No drama, no panic. Just the flat announcement of a fact delivered in the same tone a man uses to say a gas tank is empty. He reached for his sidearm, which was everything he had left, and he pressed it out in front of him with both hands and kept his eyes forward. Aiden caught it from the corner of his eye and felt the weight of it land on his chest. Rodriguez with a pistol in a rifle fight. That was not a viable solution. That was a man choosing not to stop fighting, rather than a man who had any real power to change what was happening. He reached into his own kit, pulled his second-to-last magazine, and slid it across the rock. "Sarge," Rodriguez started. "Take it." "That's yours." "Rodriguez." He looked at the man, at the dry blood on his cheek and the wet eyes that weren't quite tears, but were right at the edge of them. "You've been fighting beside me for 3 years. Take the magazine and put rounds down range." Rodriguez took it. His jaw worked for a second. Then he reloaded and opened fire and didn't say another word about it. The center group was 30 yards out when the 8th shot came. Aiden didn't see where it hit. He heard the effect, a sound from the center group that wasn't one voice, but many, a collective recoil, a backward stutter in the formation's momentum as something important was suddenly removed from it. He risked a look over the rock's edge and saw it. The center formation had lost its point man, and the 4 fighters directly behind him had broken left instead of pressing, because something in the geometry of that shot, the angle, the precision, the inexplicability of it had crossed a threshold in their fear that their training couldn't hold. They broke. Not all of them, but enough. The center push fragmented, and in the fragmentation the coordination was lost, and without coordination, a 30-man force was just 30 individual men on a dark mountain making individual decisions about their individual survival. That was the moment Priya spoke up again. Her voice was different now. Not the clipped tactical voice she used when moving through a firefight, but something quieter, more considered. The voice she used when she'd finished calculating and arrived at a conclusion she wasn't sure she wanted to share. "Aiden." She rarely used his first name in the field. He turned. "I need to tell you something." Now. She glanced toward the others briefly, then back to him. "The asset, the shooter. I've been tracking the shots. Time angle, effective range rate of lateral movement between positions." She paused. "It's one person." He stared at her. "One person," she repeated. "Not a team. Not 2 shooters working a system. One individual moving between 4 distinct positions, firing from each position no more than twice before relocating. The spacing between shots is consistent with a single human body moving at high speed through rough terrain." She met his eyes. "One person has been running this entire containment." Garza was close enough to hear. That's not possible. The math says it is." Priya looked at Garza with the patient expression of someone who has stopped being surprised by what's possible. Possible and easy are different things. Hawk had heard it too. He turned from his position face tight. "One person against 32. "Against 32, Priya confirmed. "And so far they are winning." The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something different from before. Not fear, not desperation, but a kind of stunned, involuntary reverence. The specific feeling you get when reality demonstrates something your assumptions had previously ruled out. Webb spoke first, and for once, he wasn't doing math. "Who does that? Who trains for that? Who prepares for that?" Nobody answered because nobody had an answer. But Aiden was already thinking about Rodriguez's intel, about a separate asset, about a classification level above mission compartment, about being sent to this ridge on this night along a route that had been changed 48 hours before departure. He was building something in his mind piece by piece, and he didn't like what the shape of it was starting to look like. Because if there was one person out there who had been on this mountain before they arrived, who had mapped the enemy, counted the fighters, identified the command structure, planned the sequence, then that person hadn't been sent here for Viper Squad. They'd been sent here for something else entirely. And Viper Squad's presence on this ridge was either a terrible accident of operational overlap or something deliberately constructed by people with authority and reasons that no one had shared with 8 soldiers whose job was apparently to hold a piece of rock and not die. He was still working through it when the enemy heavy weapon opened up. The sound of it was different from everything that had preceded it. A lower frequency, a slower cadence rounds that didn't just crack, but thudded against the rock with the authority of something designed to destroy cover rather than just kill what was behind it. The outcropping took 3 direct impacts in 4 seconds, and the rock itself, solid granite thousands of years old, dependable as anything Aiden had ever trusted, shuddered. "Move!" he shouted, because the rock that had been their salvation was now the target, and in approximately 30 more seconds it would be a liability rather than a shelter. The squad moved, fast and low, spreading across the ridge face, finding new positions that were smaller, less defensible, more exposed. Garza went right. Hawk went left. Priya and Webb moved together instinctively, the way soldiers who trust each other move in danger. Patel, still dealing with the impact from earlier, was slower than the rest. Aiden saw it happening before it happened, the way time in combat sometimes stretched at exactly the wrong moments, giving you the gift of perfect clarity about something you couldn't prevent. Rodriguez got there first. He grabbed Patel by the collar and threw him forward, physically hauling him out of the weapon's angle of impact, and the next round hit the space where Patel had been with a force that knocked Rodriguez sideways and left him sitting against a lower piece of rock, breathing hard. Both hands pressed flat against his thighs, checking himself for damage with the automatic thoroughness of someone who knew the drill. "Rodriguez." Aiden was beside him in 3 seconds. "Status." "I'm good." Rodriguez looked up. His eyes were fully clear. "I'm good, Sarge. Concussive effect, that's all. Nothing penetrated." He started to stand. "Stay down." "I'm good." "I said stay down." He gripped Rodriguez's shoulder hard. 1 minute. Give me 1 minute." Rodriguez sat. He looked at the hand on his shoulder, and then up at Aiden's face, and something passed between them, something that didn't require words and wouldn't have survived being translated into them anyway. Then he nodded. The heavy weapon was cycling for a second burst when it stopped. Aiden heard the shot, the 9th shot, the one that came from south-southeast, at an elevation that no one on his squad occupied, and the heavy weapon simply stopped. Not a malfunction, not a misfire. Something more absolute than that. Hawk's voice came across the position. Low, shaking slightly, not with fear, but with something adjacent to it. "The shooter just took out the gun crew." Nobody spoke for a moment. "From that distance," Webb said, and then stopped, and then said again, quieter, "From that distance." Aiden Cole sat with his hand still on Rodriguez's shoulder and looked at the dark where the shots had been coming from all night. He looked at it the way you look at something you don't fully understand, but have decided to trust anyway, the way soldiers trust the training they've been given, even when they can't see how it applies, the way a man trusts the ground under his feet, even knowing it can shift. Out there somewhere in that dark, someone was alone. Someone had been alone all night. Someone had taken 9 shots and made 9 decisions that were still keeping 8 people alive, and that someone didn't know Aiden Cole, didn't owe him anything, hadn't been ordered to care whether Viper Squad survived. They'd chosen it anyway. The enemy was pulling back. Not running, not yet, but the coordinated assault had collapsed into groups of men trying to re-establish contact with each other in the dark, trying to understand what they were fighting and where it was coming from, and whether the costs of continuing were proportional to whatever objective had put them on this mountain tonight. Garza appeared at Aiden's side, crouching low, and put his hand briefly on Rodriguez's other shoulder. A quick, wordless thing that said everything it needed to say, and then looked out into the dark. "Sarge," he said quietly, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About that shooter out there, the one person." He paused. "They've been protecting us this whole time, and we don't even know if they're okay." Another pause longer. "Doesn't that feel wrong to you? That we're just sitting here letting someone take care of us without knowing if they're taking care of themselves?" Aiden looked at the kid, 22 years old, with a photograph in his boot, and a conscience that apparently didn't take the night off, even in the middle of a firefight. "Yeah," he said honestly. "It does." "So what do we do about it?" What they could do about it was nothing. No communications, no shared coordinates, no way to reach across the dark to whoever was out there. No way to say, "We see you. We know what you're doing. We're not going to forget it." All they could do was hold, stay alive, make the protection mean something. "We do our jobs," Aiden said. "We hold this position. We stay alive, And when this is over, he stopped recalibrated because when was a word that required a certainty he hadn't fully reclaimed yet. He started again. If this comes out right, we find out who's out there. And we make sure it counts for something. Garza nodded, slowly, seriously, with the gravity of someone making a promise he intended to keep. Deal, he said. The enemy was still out there. Kareem was still alive. The heavy weapon was neutralized, but the men were not, and the night still had hours in it. And the ammunition Viper Squad had left was enough for minutes, not hours. The math had not changed. The situation had not resolved. But the squad was alive. Still ate. Still together. Still holding. And somewhere in the dark, one person was still out there. Still watching. Still calculating. Still carrying a weight that no one had asked them to carry for people they had never met for reasons that might never be spoken aloud. The 10th shot had not yet come, but Raven was already in position for it. The 10th shot came at 0441. Raven had been holding it for 11 minutes, not because she wasn't ready. She had been ready since 0430 when Kareem's remaining senior fighter, a thick-shouldered man she had mentally designated Echo 1 based on his position in the command hierarchy, had begun consolidating the scattered groups into something that looked from her elevation uncomfortably like a functional fighting force again. She had the shot. She'd had it for 11 minutes. She held it because taking it at the wrong moment would tell Kareem exactly what she needed him not to know, that there was a pattern, that the shots were connected, that one mind was running all of this. As long as Kareem believed he might be facing multiple shooters, he would continue splitting his attention in too many directions to commit fully to any one of them. The moment he understood it was a single operative, he would concentrate everything, all 30 remaining fighters, all remaining firepower, on finding and eliminating one position. So, she held. She lay completely still and ran her breathing down to the level where her body barely moved 6 breaths per minute. A discipline that had taken 2 years to master, and that she now maintained the way other people maintained posture automatically, and without conscious effort. She listened to the radio traffic she'd been monitoring through the earpiece she'd taken off a dead lieutenant 30 minutes into the engagement. Her Dari was functional enough to follow the broad shape of what Kareem was telling his men, and the broad shape was this: he knew the fire was coming from the south ridge. He didn't know the exact position. He was sending 2 men up to find it. There it was, not a problem yet. 2 men moving in the dark without knowing exactly what they were looking for would take time to cover the ground. She had maybe 6 minutes before they got close enough to narrow the search to a dangerous radius. 6 minutes was enough. She let Echo 1 take 3 more steps toward a consolidation point, where his presence would matter, where his death would matter. And then she squeezed the trigger. Echo 1 went down. The consolidation immediately stopped. Raven was moving before the sound of the shot had fully crossed the distance to the ridge. She took her new position in 45 seconds, settling into the rock with the practiced economy of someone who had done this enough times that the body knew the sequence before the mind directed it. She checked her ammunition. She counted what she had left. She did the math with the same cold clarity she brought to every calculation in the field, and the number she arrived at was tight, but workable, provided she didn't miss, provided Kareem didn't produce a surprise she hadn't already accounted for, and provided the 2 men he'd sent looking for her were slower than she expected. She could not count on any of those provisions holding. Down on the ridge, the situation was deteriorating in a way she could read from the sounds, even without line of sight to Viper Squad's position. The rifle fire from their location had thinned over the last 20 minutes, not tactically thinned the deliberate conservation of a squad managing its resources, but thinned with the particular quality of people reaching the bottom of something they couldn't refill. She had been counting their shots the same way she counted everything. They were close to empty, which meant the timeline she had been working with needed to compress. She had planned this as a gradual operation, systematic leadership attrition, sustained command disruption, allowing Kareem's force to bleed its own morale over the course of hours until the tactical calculus shifted far enough that engagement became non-viable. That was the clean version. That was the version that kept her invisible longest, and protected the integrity of the operation she had actually been sent here to run. But clean versions were contingent on conditions staying cooperative, and conditions had stopped cooperating approximately 15 minutes ago, when Kareem demonstrated that he was smarter and more adaptable than the file on him had suggested. He had reorganized under fire. He had neutralized two of her positional advantages by repositioning his own men. He had sent scouts. He was, she acknowledged without sentimentality, a genuinely skilled commander, which meant she needed to stop managing this and start finishing it. The problem was the armored vehicle. It had arrived from the north approach 12 minutes ago, which meant it had been en route before the engagement started, which meant Kareem had always intended to use it as his final option rather than his opening move insurance against a scenario where his infantry assault failed. She had known about it from her pre-mission surveillance, but had expected a 30-minute longer window before it arrived. The timeline compression had cut that window in half, and the vehicle was now positioned in a way that gave it a clean firing line to the ridge where Viper Squad was holding. If Kareem put that vehicle into active engagement, Viper Squad would have approximately 90 seconds. She needed to neutralize it before he made that call. The vehicle's vulnerable point was not armor. Armor was not her problem to solve with the rifle she was carrying. The vulnerable point was the fuel coupling on the external port, a design choice made by men who had built the vehicle for a different conflict and had not anticipated the specific operational environment it now occupied. She had noted it during her surveillance hours before the engagement. She had noted it the way she noted everything, without excitement, without the need to tell anyone about it, simply filing it in the catalog of available options that might become necessary. It had become necessary. The shot was 460 yards, angled, partially obscured by the profile of the northern spur. She would have one attempt before the crew responded and repositioned, and she would need to take it from a position that left her exposed in a way her current position did not. She ran the calculation one more time. The math was what it was. You did not argue with math. She moved. On the ridge, Aiden felt the firefight changing before he could articulate how. The pressure that had been building against their position not constant but rhythmic, like something testing the structure of their resistance, looking for the weak point, had shifted in texture. The enemy was pulling their center group back, not retreating, repositioning. And the repositioning had a geometry to it that Priya identified before anyone else. "They're clearing a field of fire," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge in it that Aiden had learned to pay attention to, the edge that appeared when she'd finished her calculation and didn't like the answer. "They're opening a lane from the north approach." "For what?" She looked at him. "Sarge, there's a vehicle on the northern spur. I saw headlights 4 minutes ago. I didn't say anything because I thought—" She stopped. "I thought the shooter would handle it." Hawk's head snapped toward her. "You saw a vehicle and didn't—" "I said I didn't say anything." Her voice sharpened. "I made a judgment call, and I'm telling you now because the judgment call may have been wrong. There's a vehicle. Northern spur. They're making room for it." The silence that followed lasted about 1 second before Aiden processed the implications and moved past processing into action. "What kind?" "Armored. Light armor, not a tank, but enough that our rifles can't do anything about it." Webb finished. He said it flatly. Not with despair, just the flat acknowledgement of fact that was Webb's particular brand of courage. "We literally cannot stop an armored vehicle with what we're carrying." Garza made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He caught himself, pressed his jaw shut, and went very still, in the way young soldiers went still when they were preventing themselves from saying something that wouldn't help. "Garza," Aiden said. "I'm fine. I know you are. Talk to me anyway." A pause. "I was thinking about my mom." He said it simply without apology. "I do that when you know. When it looks like—" He stopped again. "She doesn't know where I am. I mean, she knows roughly, she knows I deployed, but she doesn't know this mountain or this night or any of—" He exhaled. "I just want her to know I wasn't scared. You know, I want her to know I did my job." Nobody laughed. Nobody offered empty reassurance. Rodriguez reached over without looking and put his fist against Garza's shoulder, a soldier's contact brief and solid and completely sufficient. "She'll know," Rodriguez said, "because you're going to tell her." The conviction in his voice was so complete that Garza actually nodded, as if Rodriguez had reminded him of something he'd temporarily forgotten. Aiden turned back to the problem. To the vehicle on the northern spur. To 30 fighters who were now arranged in a cordon that funneled toward their position. To a squad with near-empty magazines and no communications, and 8 people who had been doing everything right all night and were still running out of options. Then the explosion happened. Not a mortar round. Not a rifle shot. An explosion with a distinct quality that Aiden recognized from a training incident 3 years prior, a fuel ignition, the particular fast-blooming sound of combustible material finding its moment. It came from the direction of the northern spur. It lit the low clouds above the ridge in a brief, fierce orange that was visible for miles and then compressed into secondary burning. The armored vehicle had just stopped being a threat. The squad stared in the direction of the light. Webb spoke first because Webb always spoke first when numbers stopped adding up the way they should. "That was the vehicle." "Yeah," Aiden said. "She shot the vehicle." "Yeah." "From where she was from the south ridge that shot was—" Webb did the calculation in his head and then went quiet with the specific expression of someone who has arrived at a number they need a moment to accept. "That was an extraordinary shot." Hawk let out a long, shaking breath. "That's the understatement of my entire military career." But Aiden wasn't celebrating. He was watching the enemy response. And the enemy response was not what he expected. He expected disarray. He expected the vehicle's destruction to do what the earlier shots had done: fracture confidence, scatter coordination, buy time. Instead, what he saw was Kareem's remaining fighters consolidating with a speed and discipline that told him the commander had anticipated this contingency and prepared for it. Kareem had a backup plan. Kareem had always had a backup plan. The fighters were moving in a wedge now, 19 men, tight formation advancing on the ridge with a momentum that absorbed the loss of the vehicle, the way water absorbs a stone. A brief disturbance. Then the surface closes and keeps moving. They were 40 yards out. 35. "Here they come," Priya said, and her voice had gone to that place. It went in extremis, perfectly flat, perfectly clear, all emotion extracted and set aside for later if later existed. "Everyone up, everything we have left." Aiden brought his rifle up, counted his remaining rounds. Made the calculation he'd been avoiding, the one that put the cost of the next 4 minutes into numbers that didn't work out in their favor, and then he set the calculation down and put his eye to the scope and got ready. Beside him, Garza was up. Rodriguez was up. Hawk Webb. Priya Patel, all of them up, all of them forward, all of them burning the last of what they had to hold the line for, as long as holding it was possible. And Raven was in trouble. She had made the shot on the vehicle. She had made it from a position that required her to expose a significant portion of her profile to take the necessary angle, and she had taken that position, knowing it was a risk, and accepting the risk as the cost of the outcome she needed. The fuel coupling had ignited exactly as she'd calculated. The vehicle was neutralized. But the 2 scouts Kareem had sent to find her had been closer than she expected. They had not located her position. But the muzzle flash from the vehicle, shot unavoidable at that distance, and with that trajectory, had given them enough directional information to narrow the search to a 50-yard corridor. She heard them moving toward her in the dark, felt the approach, rather than saw it, the particular quality of intentional human movement in terrain, the way it created small disturbances in the sounds around it. She had 2 options. Relocate and risk losing the shot on Kareem's advancing wedge, which would remove the one intervention that could still keep Viper Squad alive for the next 60 seconds. Or stay in position, take the shot she needed, and deal with the scouts from a compromised location with whatever time remained. She stayed. This was not a heroic decision. It was a professional one. The wedge of 19 men was 30 yards from Viper Squad's position. The squad was nearly out of ammunition. If she relocated, the time required to re-establish a firing solution from a new position was time Viper Squad didn't have. The scouts were close, but they weren't on her. She had maybe 90 seconds before they were. She needed 70. She found Kareem. He was at the back of the wedge, which was where she had expected him. Not because he was cowardly. She had stopped thinking that about him hours ago, but because he was intelligent, and an intelligent commander stayed back where he could see the whole picture. He was directing the advance with those hand signals she had spent hours cataloging. She watched his hands. Confirm the signal he was using: push forward, maintain formation, do not stop. She confirmed his position. She settled her breathing. The scouts were getting closer. She could hear the nearer one's footsteps now, maybe 20 yards. She fired. Kareem went down. The wedge formation broke. Not gradually, not with the slow unraveling of a force that has lost a leader, but can still function in the interim. It broke immediately, completely, in the way that only happens when the entire structure of an operation has been built around one man's will, and that will is suddenly removed. Men who had been advancing with the compact momentum of a coherent unit suddenly became individuals again, and individuals in that moment, in the dark on a mountain, having just watched their commander fall, made individual calculations that all led to the same answer. This is not worth it. 12 men ran. 6 more followed within 30 seconds. The remaining fighters, the most disciplined, the ones who would have been leaders in another hour, if they'd had another hour, looked at each other, and then at the ridge, where 8 American rifles were still pointing at them, and they took what cover they could find and stopped advancing. The wedge was gone. Kareem was gone. Down on the ridge, Aiden Cole saw the formation break and understood what it meant before his mind had assembled all the reasons why. He had watched enough engagements collapse to recognize the moment when a force crossed from tactical setback to psychological defeat. This was that moment. The enemy's spine had been removed. "They're breaking," Hawk said, and his voice was something Aiden had never quite heard from Hawk before. Not relief, not triumph, something rawer than either. The sound of a man who has held his breath for 3 hours and is only just beginning to believe he can exhale. "Hold position," Aiden said immediately. "Nobody moves. Don't give them a reason to regroup." "Are they actually?" "Hold." He kept his rifle up, kept his eye on the retreating fighters and the 6 who had gone to ground. "Wait." They waited. 2 minutes. 3. The 6 fighters who had stayed began one by one to pull back. Not running, moving with the careful face-saving deliberateness of men who needed to believe they were making a strategic withdrawal rather than fleeing, but moving away. All of them, in the same direction, away from the ridge. Garza made a sound. Just a sound, no words, not even a word trying to be born, just a sound from the chest that was everything he'd been carrying for the last 3 hours, releasing at once. He sat down where he was standing and put both hands over his face and shook slightly, and nobody said anything about it, because there was not one person on that ridge who didn't understand exactly what that felt like. Rodriguez crouched beside him, put both hands on Garza's shoulders. Hey, kid, you did your job." Garza looked up. His eyes were wet, and he wasn't trying to pretend they weren't. "We made it. We made it. I need to call my mom." Rodriguez laughed. It came out shaking and real and completely uncontrolled, the laugh of a man who had just realized he was still alive, and Hawk started laughing too from 3 feet away, and even Webb, methodical, calculating. Webb put his face against the cold rock and laughed into the stone until the sound of it became something else, something that was laughter and grief and relief all at once. Aiden didn't laugh. He was already on his feet, already scanning the south ridge, already looking for the position that had saved them 11 times over the course of a night that should have ended differently. He couldn't see anyone, couldn't see movement. And then Priya was beside him, and she said the thing he'd been afraid she was going to say. She went quiet after that last shot. He turned to her. "Before the wedge broke," Priya said carefully. "There was a delay between the shot and when the wedge broke, about 8 seconds. And since then, nothing from that position. No movement, no secondary shot." She paused. "The scouts were up there, Aiden. Kareem sent 2 men up before the wedge moved, And the last shot required a position that was exposed. He stared at the south ridge. "She may be fine," Priya said. "She's obviously extraordinary at what she does, and she may be completely fine, and I may be misreading the silence." "But," he said. She met his eyes. "But I don't think we should assume that." He turned to Webb. "Can we raise command yet?" Webb had been working the radio for the last 2 minutes. He looked up, and Aiden read the answer on his face before he spoke. "Still jammed." "Then we move." Hawk looked up sharply. "To where?" Aiden pointed to the south ridge, to the dark, to the place where 11 shots had come from and where no 12th shot had followed, to the place where someone had been alone all night, carrying something no one had asked them to carry, and who might now need someone to do for them exactly what they had done for 8 strangers on a mountain. "There," he said. The squad looked at him. They looked at the dark, and not one of them argued. Aiden moved first, and the squad followed without a word. That was the thing about Viper Squad after a night like this one. The usual friction of decision-making, the back and forth of men with opinions and survival instincts and reasonable objections, had burned away completely. What was left was something simpler and more absolute. They trusted him, not because he had all the answers, but because he had been wrong about nothing that mattered tonight, and because the direction he was pointing toward the dark, toward the south ridge, toward the silence where 11 shots had come from and no 12th had followed, was the only direction any of them could live with taking. Hawk fell in behind him without being asked. Rodriguez checked his borrowed magazine, verified he had rounds, and moved. Garza was up off the ground and in formation before the sound of Aiden's boots had fully registered. Even Webb, who processed everything through the filter of probability and cost, looked once at the south ridge and once at Aiden's back, and made his choice. Priya was already ahead of them. She had moved the moment Aiden said they're slipping forward with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already done the calculation and arrived at the same answer before he'd spoken it. She was 30 feet out when Aiden caught up to her, and she didn't look back, didn't slow down, just said in a low voice as he pulled alongside her. 2 scouts. That's what we're walking into. Whatever condition she's in, 2 of Kareem's men were moving toward that position when the last shot fired. I know. They may still be up there. I know that too. She glanced at him sidelong. You're not concerned. I'm extremely concerned, but concerned doesn't change the direction. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. No, she said. It doesn't. They moved up the southern approach in a spread formation, tight enough to communicate wide enough that one burst of fire couldn't take multiple men simultaneously. The slope was steep, and the footing was uncertain, and every one of them was running on 3 hours of combat adrenaline, and whatever reserves of will a person accumulates over years of choosing this life. Garza was breathing harder than he should have been, favoring his left leg in a way he hadn't been. An hour ago, something had happened to it in the chaos of the repositioning, and he hadn't mentioned it, and Aiden had decided not to notice it yet, because noticing it would mean stopping. And stopping was not available right now. They were 70 yards up the slope when Hawk raised a fist. Everyone stopped. Everyone went still. Ahead, somewhere in the dark, a sound. Not movement exactly. Something slower than movement. Something with the specific quality of a person trying not to make sound and not entirely succeeding. Aiden hand-signaled 2 fingers spread, moving in a slow arc. Hawk and Rodriguez peeled left. Webb and Patel held center. Aiden kept moving forward with Priya on his right shoulder and Garza limping but present on his left. The sound came again. Closer now. And then a voice, low, controlled, masculine speaking in Dari, said something that Aiden's functional but limited language training translated roughly as she went this way. His hand was up before the thought was complete. Full stop. 2 scouts. Still up here, still searching. Aiden looked at Priya. She had heard it too. She was already reading the direction of the voice, triangulating with the quiet precision that had kept her alive through more bad nights than she discussed openly. She held up 2 fingers. Confirmed. Then she pointed left forward and right forward. The 2 men were separated by approximately 15 yards, moving on diverging paths that would converge at a point approximately 40 feet ahead. At whatever was at that point. Aiden didn't think. He moved. He covered the ground between his position and the nearer scout in 8 seconds. 8 seconds of the particular focused silence that combat teaches, where the body becomes very efficient and very quiet and very certain about what it needs to do. The scout heard him at the last possible moment, started to turn, and Aiden took him down with a controlled efficiency that was over before the man's training could respond. Not lethal. Subdued. The man went to ground breathing, and would continue breathing, which was the outcome Aiden wanted, because dead men couldn't answer questions. The second scout heard the brief disturbance and spun toward it. Rodriguez came out of the dark from the left, and that situation resolved itself in 4 seconds, with the same outcome: down breathing, subdued. Silence returned. Aiden straightened, looked ahead at the point where the two search paths had been converging. He moved toward it, and Priya was already there, crouching over something. Someone in the dark, and she looked up at him as he arrived with an expression that held several things simultaneously, the way faces do when a situation is complicated, and there is no time to separate the components. "She's alive," Priya said. He exhaled. "But she's hit." The exhale stopped. Raven was conscious. That was the first thing he registered when he got close enough. Her eyes were open and tracking, moving from his face to Priya's, to the surrounding darkness, and back again, with the reflexive alertness of someone whose survival instincts hadn't gotten the message that the immediate threat had passed. She had one hand pressed against her left side below the ribs, and the hand was dark with blood that was fresh enough to still be wet. Her rifle was across her body, her right hand still within reach of it, and she had, he realized with a jolt, been preparing to use it on them when she'd recognized in the last second that the approaching figures were American. She had not made a sound. Not when they'd approached, not when Priya had found her, not from whatever had put that blood on her hand. She was looking at him now with eyes that were clear and assessing, and gave absolutely nothing away about what she was feeling, which he suspected was quite a lot. "Viper Squad," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled. The voice of someone who had decided that steadiness was non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. "Yeah," he said. A pause. "You shouldn't be here." "Probably not." He crouched beside her. "How bad?" "Through and through. Left side below the floating rib. Missed the major structures." She said it with the clinical detachment of someone reading off an instrument panel rather than describing their own body. "I've applied pressure. I need approximately 20 minutes of stillness, and then I can move." "You've done this before," Priya said quietly. Not a question. Raven looked at her. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not softening exactly, but a fractional adjustment the way a door opens just enough to show that there's light on the other side. Enough times. Garza arrived limping and stopped when he saw her. He looked at the blood on her hand and the rifle across her body, and the expression on her face that was neither distress nor pretense, and he did something that nobody else had done. He sat down beside her, not in a medical capacity, not in a tactical capacity, just close the way people sit close to each other when closeness itself is the thing that's needed. "Hi," he said. She looked at him. "Hi, I'm Garza, Tony Garza." He said it like they were meeting at a reasonable hour under reasonable circumstances. "You saved my life about 8 times tonight." "I wasn't counting," she said. "I was." He met her eyes. 11 shots. I counted every one. Something happened in her face then. Quick and involuntary, like a light switched on and then immediately deliberately switched off again. She looked away from him, looked at the dark, and pressed her hand harder against her side and said nothing for a moment. Aiden watched it happen and understood something he hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't just a mechanism. She wasn't just a capability or an asset or an operative file with a code name and a clean security classification. She was a person who had been alone on a mountain all night, making decisions that no one had asked her to make for people she had never met, and the cost of that was written on her face in the half-second before she put it away again. He waited until she looked back at him. "We're not leaving you here," he said. I didn't ask you to stay. No, you didn't. He held her gaze. I'm telling you anyway. She studied him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that people who work alone develop the ability to assess another person's character quickly and accurately, because in their line of work, misreading someone's intentions was a survival error. Whatever she found in Aiden's face seemed to satisfy something, because she gave a small, precise nod and stopped arguing. Webb appeared at Aiden's shoulder. He had been scanning their position since he arrived, checking angles, assessing exposure, running the tactical picture with the automatic efficiency that was simply how Webb existed in the world. He crouched and said quietly, "We have a problem." Aiden looked at him. "The 6 fighters who went to ground when the wedge broke." Webb kept his voice low and even. "I tracked their last visible position before we moved, based on the direction they were moving." He paused, and in the pause, Aiden felt the familiar drop in his stomach that preceded information he didn't want. They weren't withdrawing south with the others. They went east, which means they may be circling the ridge. Circling toward us, toward this position. Webb met his eyes. "Kareem is down. The operation is functionally over. But those 6 men have a different motivation now." Priya said it before Aiden could. "Revenge." "That's my read," Webb said. 6 men no longer operating under a command structure, no longer bound by a tactical objective. Personal motivation is harder to predict and harder to manage than tactical motivation. Raven had been listening. She spoke without moving, without changing her position, her voice carrying the same flat certainty as everything she said. "The eastern approach to this ridge has 2 viable paths. One is 40 yards north of our current position. One is 30 yards south. If they're circling, they'll hit one of those 2 points in—" She paused, calculating 14 minutes, maybe 12. Everyone looked at her. "I've been on this mountain for 3 days," she said simply. "I know the terrain." Aiden absorbed that. 3 days. She had been here for 3 days alone, learning this mountain the way you learned something you knew you would need completely. He filed it beside everything else he had learned about her tonight and felt the shape of it add to an understanding that was still incomplete, but growing. 12 minutes, he said. "Webb Rodriguez north path. Hawk Patel south path. Priya stays here. Garza." "I'm fine," Garza said immediately. "Your left leg disagrees." "A beat." "I'm functional." "You stay with Priya and cover this position." He looked at Garza with the expression that allowed no negotiation. "That's not a bench. That's a post. You understand?" Garza's jaw tightened, then released. "Roger that." Raven watched this exchange with the focus of someone cataloging information she might need. Then she looked at Aiden and said, "There's something you should know before you go." He stayed. She looked at her hand, the one pressed against her side, and then back at him. "I was not sent here for you. My operation has nothing to do with Viper Squad. Your presence on this ridge tonight was a conflict in the operational space that no one in your command structure told you about." She paused. "That is not an accident." Aiden felt the ground shift under him. Not literally, but with the quality of a man who has been carrying a suspicion for 3 hours and just had it confirmed by the one person who would know. "They used us," he said. "You were a secondary element in an operation you weren't read into." Her voice carried no judgment, just information delivered with the precision she applied to everything. "Your route was modified 2 days ago. The modification placed you on this ridge on this night. I don't know who made that decision or why, but it wasn't accidental." Rodriguez's words from hours earlier came back to him with new weight. Something they didn't want us to know about because the classification level was above mission compartment. He turned it over and over, and the shape of it didn't change no matter how many times he looked at it. His squad had been placed on this mountain like pieces on a board. By someone who knew Raven would be here. By someone who had calculated, or hoped, or gambled that the presence of 8 soldiers would complicate Kareem's operation enough to give Raven the operational space she needed. They'd been used as a distraction. 8 men. Used as a distraction, he breathed. "Let it settle. chose deliberately consciously to set down the anger that came with it, because anger right now was weight he couldn't carry, and they weren't off the mountain yet. "When this is over," he said, "I'm going to want answers." "You should want them," she said. "Whether you'll get them is a different question." "Are you going to help me get them?" She looked at him for a long moment. In that look was something that was neither promise nor refusal. A consideration happening in real time, a woman calculating whether trust in this specific direction served something she valued or contradicted it. "I'll tell you what I can," she said finally. It wasn't everything, but it was real, and he knew the difference between something real and something offered to close a conversation. He nodded. 12 minutes, he said, and went. The next 12 minutes were the longest and the shortest of the night simultaneously. Aiden and his split teams moved to cover both approach paths with the efficiency of soldiers who had been burning on fumes for hours and had somehow found another level underneath the fumes. The ridge was quieter now than it had been at any point since 0317. The firing had stopped, the enemy was gone or hiding or circling, and the mountain had returned to its own business, indifferent to everything that had happened on its surface tonight. Webb's voice came low in his ear. No radio, just proximity. "North path, I have movement." Aiden moved toward him. Stayed low. Got eyes on the approach angle, and confirmed it 3 figures moving with the specific quality of men who believed they were being careful, but were operating on grief and anger rather than discipline. They were not moving tactically. They were moving with the stumbling, forward-leaning momentum of people pursuing something personal. He felt the weight of it. They had lost their commander tonight. They had lost colleagues. They were on a dark mountain far from wherever home was for them, following a purpose that had been stripped away, reduced now to this 3 men in the dark looking for someone to hold accountable. He understood it. He didn't act on the understanding. "Wait," he told Webb and Rodriguez. Low, patient. Let them commit to the path. They committed. All 3 moved fully onto the approach, and Aiden and his men came at them from 2 directions simultaneously, not firing, not killing, because killing 3 men who were functionally defeated was not something Aiden Cole did when a better option existed. He had been in enough wars to know the difference between necessary violence and violence that served nothing except a feeling. It was fast. It was controlled. 3 men went down breathing, flex-cuffed with the restraints Webb produced from his kit, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who had been carrying them precisely for outcomes like this one. Rodriguez stood over the 3 prone fighters and looked at Aiden with an expression that was tired and human and completely honest. "What do we do with them?" "We leave them for extract. They'll be found." He looked at the 3 men breathing secured, not going anywhere. "They're done fighting tonight." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, they are." Hawk's voice came from the south, equally quiet. 3 more. South path. Same situation." A pause. "We handled it." 6. All 6 accounted for. Non-lethal. Done. When Aiden got back to Raven's position, she was sitting up. Not fully upright, her left side wouldn't allow that yet, but elevated her back against the rock, her rifle across her knees, the field dressing Priya had applied while he was gone, already taped and tight. Garza was still beside her. The 2 of them had been talking. Apparently, he could see it in the looseness around Garza's jaw, the slight relaxation that came from the specific relief of conversation with someone who didn't need anything softened. Raven looked up when Aiden arrived, read his face. Both paths. 6 men, none of them permanent. Something moved in her expression. Not surprise, she didn't seem to do surprise, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of a choice he'd made. "You didn't have to do it that way." "Yes, I did." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Garza. "Your sergeant," she said quietly, "is one of those people." Garza glanced between them. "What people?" "The ones who decide what kind of war they're going to fight before the war starts, and don't renegotiate it in the middle." She paused. "There aren't many of them." Garza looked at Aiden with the expression of someone hearing a thing they already believed confirmed by a source they hadn't expected. He nodded once slowly, as if filing it somewhere important. Priya moved to Aiden's side. "She's stable. We need to move before the temperature drops further and the blood loss compounds the exposure risk." She said it medically clinically, but there was something under the clinical surface that Aiden recognized, a protectiveness that had nothing to do with professional obligation. "Can you walk?" he asked Raven. "I can walk," she said in the tone of someone for whom "can you walk" is not a question they've ever answered any other way. He reached down. She looked at his extended hand for 1 second. That calculating look, the cost-benefit of accepting help from someone she had not until 3 hours ago known existed. Then she took it, and he pulled her up, and when she was upright, he felt the slight adjustment in her breathing that told him standing cost her something, and he kept his hand at her arm until her footing was certain. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need her to. "Comms are still jammed," Webb reported. He'd been working the radio continuously. "But the jam has a pattern. It's been cycling every 22 minutes. We're 5 minutes from the next open window if the pattern holds." "You cracked their jamming pattern," Raven said, looking at Webb with the specific quality of professional respect. Webb blinked. It's a repeating interval. It's not." "It's exactly that," she said. "Good work." Webb looked for one unguarded moment, like a man who had been told something he would remember for a long time. Then he went back to the radio. 4 minutes and 53 seconds later, the jam lifted. Webb established contact with command in 30 seconds, because Webb had been composing the message in his head for the last hour and delivered it with the compressed efficiency of a man who had been waiting to say exactly these words. Viper Squad. 8 personnel. Grid reference. 2 priority medical. Request immediate extract. Situation controlled. The response came back in under a minute. Extract confirmed. QRF en route. ETA 22 minutes. 8 people stood on the south face of a ridge that didn't have a name and listened to the sound of a night that had stopped trying to kill them. Garza laughed again, that same helpless, full-body laugh from earlier, the one that was relief and exhaustion and the specific joy of being alive when alive had been negotiable. Rodriguez put his arm around the kid's shoulders and let him laugh. Hawk tilted his head back and stared at whatever was above him. Clouds dark, the absence of things trying to kill him, and breathed. Aiden stood beside Raven and said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the ridge, at the position where Viper Squad had held. At the distance between that position and where she had been working all night, the distance she had been managing, calculating bridging with 11 shots, and whatever combination of training and will and personal choice had put her on this mountain in the first place. "The debrief is going to be interesting," he said. "You won't be debriefed together," she said. "Your debrief and mine will happen in separate facilities under separate classification protocols, and the operational record will not reflect tonight the way tonight actually happened." He absorbed that. Meaning what I did tonight will not appear in any document you are ever cleared to read. Meaning the intervention will be attributed to other factors in your official record. Meaning that in approximately 72 hours the official version of this night will not include me at all. She said it without bitterness. Without anything really, the flat delivery of a fact that had been true for 4 years and showed no signs of changing. "That's the job. And you're okay with that?" She turned to look at him then. Really look at him. And in her face, in the stripped-down honesty of a person who had stopped pretending. For one unguarded moment, he saw something that was neither okay nor not okay. Something more complicated, more human, more real than either category could contain. "I do the job," she said. "Whether I'm okay with all of it is a question I answer on my own time." He nodded. He understood that. He understood it the way soldiers understood most true things, not with his mind, but with the part of him that had been doing this long enough to know which questions had clean answers and which ones you just carried. The sound of rotors began to build somewhere to the north, far off, but coming. 22 minutes. Webb said unnecessary and perfect. Because sometimes you said the thing everyone already knew just to make it real. Aiden looked at his squad. At 8 people who had held an impossible position against impossible odds and were still standing. At Garza, with his bad leg and his photograph, and his mother, who was going to hear his voice on the phone in approximately 6 hours. At Rodriguez with his borrowed magazine and his 2-language profanity, and his hands that had been steady all night, when steady was the only thing available. At Hawk and Webb and Priya and Patel, each carrying their own version of this night, each marked by it in ways that would take months to fully understand. And at Raven, standing slightly apart, watching the approaching dark with the patience of someone accustomed to existing at the edge of the picture, just outside the frame where the official story got told. He made himself a promise he'd made once before tonight, and was making again with more weight behind it. He was going to find out who she was. Not her file name, not her operational classification. He was going to find out who Elena Vasquez had been before she stopped existing officially, and what she had decided when that man with no business card had sat across from her, and whether the life she was living now was the one she had chosen, or the one that had been chosen for her. It wouldn't be easy. It might not be possible. But 8 people were alive on this mountain tonight because of her, and the least he could do was try. The rotors grew louder. Nobody spoke. The mountain held them all, the living, the exhausted, the bleeding, the ghost, and for the length of a breath, everything was still. The helicopter came in hard and fast, the way extract birds always came when the crew had been briefed on a hot zone, not hovering, not waiting, just dropping into the landing zone, with the aggressive confidence of pilots who trusted that the people on the ground had done their jobs. The rotors hit Aiden's chest before the bird was fully visible, that deep, percussive thump that every soldier learned to recognize as the sound of someone coming to bring them home. Garza heard it and straightened up despite his leg. Rodriguez heard it and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 hours. Hawk just stood there with his eyes closed for 2 full seconds, letting the sound wash over him like something he'd been afraid he wasn't going to hear again tonight. Aiden was watching Raven. She had taken 3 steps away from the squad the moment the rotors became audible. Not dramatically, not the gesture of someone making a point, but the quiet automatic repositioning of a person who had spent years understanding that proximity to official processes was a liability when your existence wasn't in any official record. She was calculating exit. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the direction her eyes were moving, in the way her hand had gone to the strap of her rifle, the unconscious preparation of departure. He moved to her before she could take step 4. "You're not walking off this mountain alone," he said. She looked at him. "That's exactly what I'm doing. You have a through-and-through wound and blood loss, and I have a field dressing and a protocol for this situation and a secondary extraction point 3 kilometers east that is already activated." Her voice was patient, not cold. The patience of someone explaining a reality rather than defending a preference. "My extract does not come from the same chain as yours. It never does. This is not stubbornness, Sergeant. This is procedure." "Procedure," he repeated. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. At the blood that had soaked through the field dressing despite Priya's work, not catastrophically, but enough to be read clearly in the low light. At the 3 days without sleep quality behind her eyes, that she was managing well, but couldn't fully conceal from someone paying attention. At the absolute unmoving certainty in her face that said this was not a negotiation. "Give me something," he said. "A name, a number. A way to verify you made it." She studied him. That calculating look again, the one that ran faster than most people's full conversations. "Why? Because 8 people are alive tonight because of you. And I am not getting on that helicopter not knowing if you're going to be alive tomorrow." Something shifted in her face. It was small and fast, and she controlled it almost immediately. But he was close enough and paying close enough attention to catch it a crack in the operational surface. Brief as a camera flash showing something underneath that was tired and real and had been carrying its own weight for a very long time. "Raven," she said quietly. "You already know that. That's a code name. Yes? I want a real one." The helicopter was 30 seconds out. The rotor wash was building, pressing against everything, clothing loose equipment, the short hairs on the back of his neck. She looked at him, and for one moment she was not Raven the operative, or the asset, or the ghost, or the 11 shots in the dark. She was a woman on a mountain who had been alone for 3 days making decisions that cost something, and she was deciding right now whether one more thing was worth the cost. "Elena," she said, just the one word. He held it. "If I don't make my secondary extract point by 700, she said, "there is a channel. Your intelligence handler, whoever runs your debrief, will know how to flag a welfare concern through the right protocol. Use the phrase operational continuity verification, and your handler will understand what it means." She paused. "That is more than I have given anyone in 4 years." He believed her, not because she seemed sentimental about it, because she didn't. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you." The 2 words landed differently than she expected he could see that. She had probably been thanked before in the abstract, the way people thank systems and institutions and capabilities. But this was specific, and it was personal, and it was delivered by a man who meant it with every piece of himself he had available after a night like this one, and she wasn't entirely prepared for it. She didn't say "you're welcome." What she said was, "Get your people home." Then the helicopter hit the ground, and everything became noise and wind and organized chaos. And when Aiden turned back from directing his squad onto the bird and looked over his shoulder toward the south ridge, Elena Vasquez was already gone. The debrief happened in 3 stages and 2 locations, which was exactly what Raven had told him would happen, which told him she had been right about everything else she'd said about how the official record would handle tonight. The first stage was on the forward operating base 8 hours after extract, a preliminary interview conducted by 2 officers who asked questions in the careful, measured way of people whose job was to understand events without necessarily recording them accurately. Aiden answered every question with precision and completeness, and without mentioning a single shot that had come from the South Ridge. Not because he had been told to omit it. Because he had made a decision on the helicopter that the story he told official channels would not include elements that could compromise someone who had taken 11 shots on behalf of his squad and disappeared into the dark afterward. He could live with that omission. He had decided he could live with it before the bird had cleared the mountain. The second stage was at a regional facility 4 days later, conducted by a senior intelligence officer named Marsh, who had the specific kind of face that collected information professionally and released it never. Marsh had a thick folder on the table and kept his hands flat on top of it throughout the interview, which Aiden interpreted as either a deliberate negotiating posture or a habit so ingrained it had stopped being deliberate. Your after-action reports describe a sustained engagement with 32 enemy combatants, significant ammunition expenditure, successful defense of your position, and enemy withdrawal, following the destruction of their primary armored vehicle, Marsh said. Cause of vehicle destruction listed as undetermined. That's correct, Aiden said. Enemy leadership attrition is listed as significant cause undetermined. That's correct. Marsh looked at him. Sergeant Cole, in my experience, things that are undetermined are usually very specifically determined and being politely not discussed. He paused. I'm not asking you to discuss them. Aiden looked at him steadily. Then we understand each other. Marsh held the eye contact for a long moment. Then he looked down at his folder, made a notation, and moved to the next question. He was a professional, and professionals recognized when a conversation had found its useful limits. One question before the interview ended, Marsh said almost casually, the way experienced people ask the things that actually mattered. Is there anything you need from this debrief that we haven't covered? Aiden had been thinking about this moment since the helicopter. Operational continuity verification, he said. Marsh's hands went very still on the folder. I was told, Aiden said carefully, that you would understand what that means. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was a long silence in a conversation that had been moving efficiently. Marsh looked at him with an expression that had rearranged itself into something that wasn't quite readable, not alarm, not confirmation, not denial. Something more carefully neutral than any of those. That phrase, Marsh said, refers to a protocol I am not in a position to discuss with you in this setting. I know. I'm asking you to use it. Another silence. You're asking me to run a welfare check on a classified asset using a protocol I've just confirmed I'm aware of, which confirms to you that the asset exists, which... He stopped. You understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing, Aiden said. And I'm doing it anyway. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. The expression on his face was not warm and not cold, somewhere in the territory of a man who was recalibrating his understanding of the person across from him. Then he made another notation, longer this time, and closed the folder. Interview concluded, he said to the recording equipment. Then he looked at Aiden and said in a voice that was not being recorded, "Give me 48 hours." Aiden nodded. 46 hours later, a single line appeared in his secure message queue. No sender identification, no context. Just 9 words, asset confirmed operational. Secondary extract successful. No further information available. He read it 3 times. Let it settle into the specific place in his chest where the weight of that night lived. Then he deleted the message because some things were safer not existing on record. And he understood that now, in a way, he hadn't entirely understood, before a ghost operative had spent a night demonstrating what that principle looked like in practice. She was alive. She had made her extract point. She was somewhere in the world doing the work that the world would never know she was doing, and she was breathing, and that was enough. It was enough. The squad came back to full operational status 63 days after the mountain. Rodriguez's cheek healed clean, a thin scar that he wore without apparent self-consciousness, and that Hawk had already begun referring to as his war face, in a tone of voice that was 30% mockery and 70% affection. Patel's impact bruising resolved without complications. Garza's leg turned out to be a stress fracture, which he was informed about at day 12, and which he responded to by asking whether stress fractures healed the same speed, regardless of whether you complained about them. He was told yes. He did not complain about it. Priya spent the first 2 weeks writing a field report that was technically a psychological analysis of enemy command disruption patterns, and was actually the most thorough documentation of what had happened on that ridge that would ever exist. She filed it under her own name, through her own chain, classified at a level that meant almost no one would read it. She didn't file it for the people who would read it. She filed it because the things that happened needed to be written somewhere by someone who had been there, even if the writing lived behind so many doors that it might as well not exist. Webb said almost nothing about the mountain for 3 weeks. And then one evening, sitting with Aiden after a briefing that had nothing to do with anything that had happened that night, he looked at the middle distance and said, "I keep running the numbers." Aiden looked at him. Which numbers? Her numbers. 1 person, 11 shots, 4 positions, 32 enemy, 1 armored vehicle. He shook his head slowly. Every time I run it, the probability of that outcome from that starting condition is... He stopped. It's not impossible, but it requires every variable to resolve in the best possible direction. It requires no mistakes, not one. She didn't make any, Aiden said. No. Webb looked at him. That's what I can't stop thinking about. That she prepared enough and knew enough and was disciplined enough that she went into that night with a plan that had no margin for error, and she executed it without error. He paused. While bleeding. Not until the end, Aiden said. Still. They sat with that for a moment. You know what that means, right? Webb said. Statistically, operationally. What does it mean? It means she's done this before, many times. Because that level of execution doesn't come from a single situation. That's accumulated. That's years. He looked at his hands. She's been out there doing that for years, and nobody knows. We know, Aiden said. Webb nodded, slowly. Yeah, he said. We know. Garza called his mother on day 2. He sat outside the medical bay with his wrapped leg elevated and his phone pressed against his ear and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular about the food, about his bunkmates, about a show he'd been watching before deployment, about a dog he wanted to get someday. His mother talked too about the neighborhood and his aunt's new kitchen renovation and whether he was eating enough. He listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention that a person brings to ordinary things when they have recently understood that ordinary things are not ordinary at all. He didn't tell her about the mountain. He didn't tell her about the 11 shots, or the 8 men, or the woman who had been alone in the dark, deciding their lives were worth protecting. He didn't tell her that he had spent 3 hours calculating whether he would speak to her again. He told her he was good. He told her he was doing his job. He told her he would be home when he could, and that he loved her, and to give his regards to the aunt's new kitchen. When he hung up, he sat for a long time without moving, holding the phone against his knee, watching the base go about its business around him. And he thought about Elena Vasquez, who had a mother somewhere too, or had had one once, or had a life somewhere beneath the operational surface that she had submerged so completely it might never fully come back up. He thought about the moment on the mountain when she had said Garza's name back to him, Tony Garza, and the slight involuntary thing that had happened in her face when he told her he'd counted every shot. He thought about what it cost to do what she did and be unknown for it, and whether the cost accumulated over years the way Webb said the skill did quietly and visibly in a place no official record would ever reflect. He hoped she had someone, not because hope changed anything, just because some things deserved to be hoped for. The twist came from Rodriguez. It came 40 days after the mountain in the form of a conversation he had not been planning to have, and that began of all places in the mess hall over food that was bad in the specific institutional way of all military food everywhere. Rodriguez had been quiet for weeks in a way that was different from his normal quiet. Not the productive silence of a man processing, but the specific pressurized silence of a man holding something he wasn't sure whether to release. Aiden had seen it and waited because Rodriguez always talked when he was ready, and pushing him before he was ready produced nothing useful. He was ready on day 40. "I made a call," Rodriguez said. He said it to his food, then looked up. After the debrief, when we were back at base before the second interview, I made a call to someone I know in the intelligence community. Someone who owes me something from a previous deployment. Aiden put down his fork. "I gave them the phrase," Rodriguez said. "Not operational continuity, a different phrase. Something I'd heard in the prep room, the conversation I told you about. I gave my contact the phrase and asked them what it meant." Rodriguez: "I know." His voice was flat and honest. "I know it was outside protocol. I know what the classification implications are. I made the call anyway, because I needed to understand what happened on that mountain and why, and I was not going to spend the rest of my service carrying a weight I didn't fully understand." Aiden looked at him. "What did they tell you?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. In that moment, Aiden could see the weight of it, whatever it was, sitting on Rodriguez's shoulders with a physical quality, a density. The operation Raven was running, Rodriguez said carefully, was not just about Kareem. Kareem was a target, but he was a secondary target. The primary objective was intelligence documents and communications in Kareem's possession that contained information about a network operating at a level considerably above what any of us were briefed on. He paused. That intelligence was successfully retrieved, by her, before the engagement started. She had already completed her primary objective before Kareem's men even arrived on the mountain. Aiden went still. "She stayed," Rodriguez said. "After her primary objective was complete, after she had what she came for, she stayed on that mountain and ran an 11-shot engagement to protect 8 soldiers she had never met, none of which was in her mission parameters, all of which put her primary objective at risk if she had been captured or killed." He met Aiden's eyes. "She didn't have to. The mission was done. She could have been at her extract point before we even knew we were in trouble." The mess hall continued around them. Voices movement, the clatter of institutional life, and Aiden sat inside it completely still. She had already finished. She had the intelligence. She could have walked away. And she had looked at 8 soldiers on a ridge who didn't know she existed and decided alone, without orders, without authorization, without any protocol that would later credit or acknowledge or even record the decision, that she was not going to leave. That was the choice. That was what the 11 shots had actually cost. Not skill, not training, not risk to life and body, though those were real. The actual cost was the choice itself, the moment when a person who operated entirely alone, who had built a life on the premise that attachment was liability and proximity was danger, had looked at strangers in trouble and decided they were worth staying for. She made that call herself, Aiden said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Nobody told her to, Rodriguez confirmed. Nobody could have. There was nobody to tell. She was alone on a mountain with a completed mission, and she looked at our position and she made a choice that had no strategic justification and no personal benefit and no possibility of recognition. He stopped. And then she did it so well that none of us died. Aiden sat with that for a long time. Rodriguez didn't push him. He went back to his bad food and ate it with the quiet efficiency of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and is now simply being present while another person processes it. Finally, Aiden said, "Does your contact know where she is now?" No, nobody knows where she is now. That's kind of the whole point of what she does. Is she still operational? As of the last available information, yes. He nodded, absorbed it, placed it alongside the 9-word message asset, confirmed operational secondary extract, successful and built from those 2 data points. The only picture of her current existence he was ever going to have access to. She was alive. She was working. She was somewhere in the world, being unknown, doing the things she did, carrying the cost of it in the way she had apparently decided years ago was the only way to carry it. The world was safer tonight because of a woman whose name was not officially Raven and had not officially been Elena for 4 years. The world would not know that. Most of the people alive because of her would never know the specific weight of what she had chosen. Except 8 of them did. 8 soldiers who had held a ridge on a mountain with no name, who had fired their last rounds and counted their last minutes and looked into a dark that should have consumed them, knew exactly what had stood between them and the end of everything. They carried it the way she carried her own weight, not loudly, not publicly, not in any record that would survive a security review. But they carried it completely. And it was real, and it mattered, and nothing that happened afterward, no debrief, no official record, no redacted operational summary that erased her role and attributed the night's outcome to undetermined causes, could change what had actually happened on that mountain. Aiden Cole thought about her one more time on the evening before Viper Squad shipped out for the next rotation, sitting alone with the particular kind of quiet that comes after something has ended and before something new has begun. He thought about a 28-year-old woman who had been extraordinary enough at something to be approached by a man with no business card and no name, and who had said yes to whatever that man had offered, and who had been paying the price of that yes ever since in a currency that had no name in any official language. He thought about what she had said on the mountain, "I do the job. Whether I'm okay with all of it is a question I answer on my own time." He hoped she had enough of her own time. He hoped that somewhere in the margins of the life she lived, in the spaces between operations and extracts and 11-shot engagements on unnamed ridges, there was something that was hers. Something that was not the job. Something that remembered Elena Vasquez before the man with no business card made his offer. He would never know. That was not information he would ever have access to. And he had made his peace with that, the same way he made peace with all the things in this work that couldn't be resolved. You acknowledged the weight you set it where it could be carried, and you kept moving. He kept moving, but he never forgot. Not one of them did. 8 soldiers carried the knowledge of that night for the rest of their lives through subsequent deployments and homecomings, through the ordinary and the dangerous, through the years that accumulated around the mountain the way sediment accumulates around a stone. They never discussed it publicly. They never sought credit for surviving it. They never named what they knew in any room where naming it could compromise the person who had made surviving it possible. They simply lived. Fully. With the specific, unglamorous gratitude of people who understood exactly what they had been given and who had given it. And Raven continued. She was on another mountain 3 weeks later, in another classified location, running another operation that would not appear in any record accessible to the people it protected. She was precise and prepared and patient, the way she had always been, the way 4 years of this life had required her to be. She had her rifle and her training and the cold calculation that had saved her and 8 strangers and would save others before this was over. She also had one thing she had not had before: a ridge with no name on a night that the official record called undetermined. She had the memory of a 22-year-old kid from South Texas sitting beside her in the dark and saying hi, simply like they were meeting somewhere reasonable. She had the memory of a sergeant who had looked at her with the specific directness of someone who saw her, not the capability, not the asset, not the operational value, but her, and said thank you, with the full weight of a man who understood what he was thanking. She carried it quietly. The way she carried everything, and she kept doing the work. Because someone had to do it. Because the world required people who operated in the dark, who sacrificed recognition for protection, who made choices alone that kept others alive in ways they would never fully understand. Because preparation and discipline and the willingness to stay when staying was the harder choice could change what happened at the edge of everything. Because 8 people who should have died on a mountain were alive. And that, in the end, was the only record that mattered.